In the shadowed corners of Evershade, a tale of chilling retribution unfolds. Meet Mark Sullivan, a man whose dark obsession with hunting animals, using his truck, spirals into a nightmarish reality. When the spectral forms of his victims begin to haunt him, blurring the line between hunter and hunted, Mark's world descends into a terrifying descent. As each encounter brings him closer to madness, a haunting question lingers. What happens when nature's victims turn their gaze upon you? Step onto the dark roads of Evershade, where the hunted becomes the hunter, and retribution is but a shadow away. Hey everyone, I just wanted to take a moment to express my heartfelt gratitude to all of you who have joined our channel membership. Your support, even through just a small fee, makes a huge difference and helps our channel grow and thrive. Thank you for being such an integral part of our journey. You're not just members, you're part of our community, and your support means the world to us. Stay awesome. Chapter 1. The Hunter in the Shadows. The night had settled over the small town of Evershade, a veil of darkness cloaking its quiet streets. In the heart of this tranquility, there prowled a man whose reputation was as sinister as the shadows he embraced. Mark Sullivan, in his mid-40s, was a figure both known and feared. Tall, with a lean build that spoke of years spent outdoors, his eyes held a cold, calculating gleam. Mark worked for the local highway maintenance crew, a job that had him traversing the long, winding roads that cut through the dense forests surrounding Evershade. To the townsfolk, Mark was just another blue-collar worker, but there was a dark undercurrent to his mundane existence. His passion, one he pursued with an almost religious fervor, was hunting, but not the kind that required guns or arrows. Mark hunted with his truck, an old, battered beast that had seen better days but was formidable on the road. He had turned the act of hitting animals on the road into a grotesque sport, each unfortunate creature adding to his grim tally. It was a macabre boast that he shared with anyone who would listen, often embellishing the details of each kill. "Got another one last night," he'd say with a twisted smile. "A fox. Tried to be quick, but not quick enough. That makes 203. His colleagues would exchange uneasy glances, dismissing it as morbid humor, but deep down, there was a ripple of disquiet. Tonight, as Mark drove along the deserted highway, his headlights cut through the darkness, searching for his next target. The thrill of the hunt surged through him, a feeling he craved more than anything. Then he saw it, a small figure darting across the road ahead. A rabbit, its eyes caught in the beam of his headlights, frozen for a split second before attempting to flee. Mark's heart raced. He swerved deliberately, a practiced movement, aligning the truck with the terrified animal. There was a sickening thud, a brief, pitiful squeal, and then silence. A triumphant grin spread across Mark's face as he slowed down, looking in the rearview mirror at the lifeless form he'd left behind. 204, he murmured, the number rolling off his tongue like a prayer. As he drove away, leaving the rabbit in his wake, Mark was unaware that this night would mark the beginning of a terrifying descent into a world where the line between the hunter and the hunted would blur into a nightmarish reality. Chapter 2. The warning at the Crossroads Cafe. The neon sign of the Crossroads Cafe flickered in the darkness, a beacon for weary travelers and truckers alike. Mark Sullivan, still riding the high from his latest kill, pulled into the parking lot. The cafe, a favorite among locals, was a rustic establishment that promised strong coffee and greasy comfort food. Mark, craving a cup of coffee, stepped inside, the bell above the door announcing his entrance. The cafe was sparsely populated at this late hour. Truckers huddled over their meals, their conversations a low murmur. Mark ordered his coffee and took a seat at the counter, his eyes scanning the room. That's when he noticed him, a mysterious figure, sitting alone in a dimly lit corner. The man was an odd sight, draped in what seemed like a patchwork of animal skins. Around his neck hung several rabbit's paws, and foxtails adorned his belt. His eyes, dark and intense, seemed to hold centuries of secrets. Mark, ever the braggart, saw an opportunity to flaunt his gruesome hobby to someone who seemed to share an interest in animals, albeit in a different manner. Approaching the man with a swagger, Mark leaned against the table. "Quite the collection you've got there," he said, nodding towards the animal adornments. "You a hunter too? I just bagged my 204th tonight." The mysterious man lifted his gaze, and Mark felt a chill run down his spine. The man's eyes were unblinking, piercing. "These are not trophies," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "They are reminders." Mark scoffed. "Reminders of good hunts, I bet." "No," the man replied, his tone solemn. "They are reminders of lives taken, of nature's beauty destroyed. These creatures are God's creation, each life a precious gift." Mark, unsettled but defiant, laughed it off. "It's just roadkill, nothing more." The man's expression darkened, and he leaned forward. To hunt God's creations without respect is to invite nature's wrath. You carry death with you, not as a badge of honor, but as a curse. Be wary, hunter, for if you pursue God's creatures with malice, then God will hunt you. The cafe seemed to grow colder, the fluorescent lights flickering ominously. Mark, for the first time, felt a twinge of fear. He tried to dismiss the man's words as the ramblings of a lunatic, but they echoed in his mind, unshakable. "Who are you?" Mark asked, his voice tinged with a mix of curiosity and dread. But the man did not answer. Instead, he rose, his animal skins rustling, and walked past Mark, his presence like a shadow passing through the room. As he exited the cafe, Mark felt the weight of the man's warning settle over him, a foreboding feeling that something unseen and powerful had just crossed his path. The bell above the door jingled as the man left, and Mark sat there, the warmth of his coffee forgotten as a cold dread slowly crept into his heart. Chapter 3. The Endless Hunt. Mark's truck roared down the moonlit road, the night around him a cocoon of darkness, pierced only by the beams of his headlights. His encounter at the cafe had left him rattled, but he shrugged off the unease, attributing it to the stranger's unsettling presence. The road stretched endlessly before him, a familiar path he had travelled countless times. Suddenly, a large deer appeared in the middle of the road, statuesque, its eyes reflecting the truck's lights. A surge of excitement washed over Mark. "What a night!" he exclaimed, pressing down on the accelerator. The truck collided with the deer with a loud, sickening crunch. Mark glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the animal's lifeless body, but there was nothing. Shaking his head, Mark continued his journey, attributing the absence to the deer being flung into the woods by the impact. Moments later, another deer appeared, standing in the road just like the first. "My lucky night indeed," Mark chuckled, accelerating once more. The scene repeated. A thud, a glance back, and no sign of the deer. As this bizarre sequence continued, Mark's initial exhilaration turned to confusion, then to a creeping dread. It was the same deer every time, unmarked, staring at him with those haunting, reflective eyes. Fear began to gnaw at his resolve. This couldn't be happening. It was impossible. Finally, Mark reached his home, a secluded shack, surrounded by woods, far from prying eyes. The building, dilapidated and forlorn, stood as a testament to his solitary life. His hands were shaking as he killed the engine. The night's events had unnerved him more than he cared to admit. Inside, Mark sought refuge in the familiar embrace of alcohol, hoping to drown the growing terror. The beer did little to steady his nerves. As he lay in bed, the silence of the night was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house settling. Then, the noises started, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but gradually growing louder, more distinct. Whispers filled the room, an unintelligible chorus that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. The stranger's warning echoed in his mind. The wind outside howled, a mournful lament that seemed to carry with it the cries of animals, cries that Mark knew all too well. It was as if the night itself was alive with the spirits of his victims. His eyes darted around the dark room, half expecting to see those spectral creatures watching him. Mark clutched his blanket, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. Sleep was impossible. Every sound, every whisper felt like a harbinger of some unseen horror. The night dragged on, an endless, haunting vigil, leaving Mark trapped in a limbo between reality and a nightmare of his own making. Chapter 4. The Night of the Hunted. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly for Mark Sullivan. Each minute, a battle against his fraying sanity. The scuttering noises persisted, sounding like a horde of rabbits darting across his wooden floors. Mark's eyes flicked to every corner of the room, but each time he did, there was nothing there. Suddenly, a noise from outside caught his attention. It was different, heavier, like a large animal moving. With a hesitant hand, Mark pulled himself up and inched towards the window, his heart pounding in his chest. Peering out, he saw it. The deer. The same one he thought he had run over multiple times. It stood there in the moonlight, steam billowing from its nostrils, its eyes locked onto his. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The deer's gaze held him in place, an accusatory stare that seemed to penetrate his very soul. Then, the scuttering resumed inside his house. Whipping his head around, Mark caught sight of a rabbit darting across the floor. It was covered in blood, a gruesome apparition that made his stomach churn. Angered and desperate, Mark grabbed a baseball bat. "Get out!" he shouted, swinging wildly at the bloodied creature, but as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, leaving him alone with his rising panic. The rest of the night was a torturous cycle of brief, fitful dozes and abrupt awakenings to the sounds of unseen creatures moving within his home. Each time his eyelids grew heavy, a rustle or a whisper would jerk him back to wakefulness. His mind teetered on the brink of madness, images of the deer's accusing stare and the rabbit's bloodied form haunting him relentlessly. As dawn broke, the first light of morning crept into Mark's shack. He sat there, a shell of a man, exhausted and unsteady. Sleep had eluded him, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. His eyes, bloodshot and wild, reflected a night spent in terror. Reluctantly, Mark prepared for work. His movements were mechanical, driven by routine rather than will. He felt like a man condemned, walking towards an unknown fate. The memory of the previous night clung to him like a cold mist, a reminder of the unnatural horrors that now seemed to be part of his life. As he stepped outside, the morning air felt unusually heavy, as if charged with a silent warning. The trees around his home swayed gently in the breeze, their rustling leaves like whispered conversations. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching him from the woods, the eyes of those he had wronged. With a deep, unsteady breath, Mark got into his truck. He had to go to work, to try and maintain some semblance of normalcy, but as he started the engine, and pulled away from his home, he knew deep down that his life had irrevocably changed. The boundary between his world and that of his victims had been blurred, leaving him to navigate a reality where he was no longer the hunter, but the hunted. Chapter 5. The Descent into Madness. Mark's workday passed in a blur, a mundane routine that stood in stark contrast to the terrors that plagued his nights. His interactions with colleagues were mechanical, his thoughts elsewhere, haunted by the relentless visions of the creatures he had killed. As dusk settled, Mark's apprehension grew. Driving home, the familiar dread gnawed at him, and there, as if waiting, was the deer, standing in the middle of the road, its presence now a symbol of his torment. "Why won't you die?" Mark screamed, his voice hoarse with frustration and fear. He swerved around it this time, refusing to repeat the cycle. Back at his run-down shack, the nightmare continued. The haunting had become a nightly ordeal. Foxes, rabbits, badgers, and deer, all bloodied and broken, appeared before him, only to vanish as he approached. The constant torment left him drained, a shadow of his former self. For 4 agonizing days this continued. No sleep came to Mark, each attempt interrupted by the spectres of his past cruelty. He saw the creatures everywhere, in his home, on the road, even in the shadows of his workplace. His colleagues began to notice. Mark was a shell, irritable and irrational, his eyes haunted and red-rimmed from exhaustion. One day at work, a concerned colleague approached him. "You all right, Mark? You look like hell." Mark's laugh was hollow. "Haven't slept in days," he admitted, rubbing his temples in a futile attempt to ease the tension. "What's going on? Nightmares?" the colleague inquired, his tone laced with worry. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," Mark replied, a mix of resignation and madness in his voice. "But I can't go on like this. I've booked a motel room for tonight, just to get away. Maybe there I can finally sleep." The colleague nodded sympathetically, unaware of the true extent of Mark's torment. "Hope it helps, man. You need to take care of yourself." As Mark left work that evening, his mind was focused on one thing: escape. The motel, a bland and nondescript place by the highway, was his last hope from the relentless haunting. He longed for the oblivion of sleep, a brief sanctuary from the nightmare his life had become. Checking into the motel, Mark carried with him a glimmer of hope. Perhaps here, away from the shack and the memories it held, he could find peace, however fleeting. He locked the door, turned off the lights, and lay down, yearning for the darkness to claim him, to grant him a night free from the bloodied apparitions of his victims. But as he drifted on the edge of sleep, a faint rustling sound echoed in the room, a harbinger of another sleepless night. The haunting, it seemed, was not bound to a place, but to Mark himself, a relentless reminder of the lives he had taken. And in the dim light of the motel room, the first of many ghostly creatures began to appear. Chapter 6. The Final Run. The motel room, once a symbol of hope for Mark Sullivan, erupted into chaos. The familiar scuttling, scratching and squealing filled the space, shattering the brief illusion of safety. As he opened his eyes, the nightmarish scene unfolded before him. Creatures darted around the room, leaving trails of blood in their wake. Rabbits, foxes, badgers, each more grotesque and bloodied than the last, their spectral forms a tormenting reminder of his cruel past. Mark couldn't bear it any longer. In a panic, he bolted out of the room and into the street. The night was eerily silent, the streets deserted, a ghost town under the moonlit sky. But there, in the middle of the road, stood the deer, its presence now a constant in his torment. Its eyes seemed to pierce into his very soul, a silent accusation that spoke louder than any words. As Mark stood there, paralyzed with fear, the streets suddenly came alive. Animals, all victims of his sadistic hobby, flooded the scene. Some were bloodied, others limping on broken legs, and some appeared squashed, their forms barely recognizable. It was as if every creature he had ever hit had returned, their spectral forms filling the street with an otherworldly horror. Terrified and desperate, Mark began to run. He screamed incoherently, a man driven to the brink of insanity by the relentless haunting. The creatures seemed to follow him, their ghostly forms appearing at every turn. The streets of the town twisted and turned into a labyrinthine nightmare, each corner revealing more of the ghastly apparitions. Mark ran without direction, his mind consumed by fear. He didn't realize how far he had gone until he burst onto the main highway. The road was dark, save for the occasional distant headlights. His breaths were ragged, his body fueled by adrenaline and terror. Suddenly, the blare of a truck's horn shattered the night. Mark turned, his eyes wide with realization, but it was too late. The truck hit him squarely, the impact echoing through the silent night. As their truck screeched to a halt, the driver stumbled out, his face pale with shock. He saw Mark's body, lifeless on the asphalt, an end to a chase that had consumed him. The spectral creatures, witnesses to his final moments, began to fade as the night reclaimed its silence. The deer, the constant in his haunting, gave one last look before it too disappeared, its message delivered. In the stillness of the highway, the tragic irony of Mark Sullivan's end was laid bare. The hunter, consumed by his own cruelty, had become the hunted, his life ending under the very wheels he once wielded as weapons. And as dawn broke, a new day began, free from the echoes of his tormented existence. Final chapter. The legacy continues. Several nights after the tragic end of Mark Sullivan, another driver found himself navigating the winding roads that skirted the edges of Evershade. The night was dark, the moon obscured by heavy clouds, lending an ominous feel to the journey. The driver, in a hurry to reach his destination, was pushing the speed limit, his car's headlights cutting a narrow path through the darkness. Suddenly, his heart leapt into his throat as a deer appeared in the middle of the road, caught in the glare of his headlights. Reacting instinctively, he slammed on the brakes, the car swerving before coming to a stop at the side of the road. Its side scraped, teared and dented from colliding with a guardrail. Breathing heavily, the driver stepped out to assess the damage. His mind was a whirl of relief and frustration. "Thank God," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "I could never forgive myself if I'd hit you." He turned back to where the deer had stood, expecting to see it retreating into the woods, but instead, there was only a man walking away. The driver squinted in the dim light, taking in the stranger's unusual attire. The man's clothes were made from patched animal skins. Foxtails adorned his belt, and a heavy necklace of rabbit paws hung around his neck. There was something unsettlingly familiar about the figure, an echo of a story he'd heard, a tale of a man consumed by his own cruelty. But as quickly as the thought came, it vanished, lost in the night, as the man in animal skins disappeared from view. The driver shook his head, attributing the strange sight to the stress of the near accident. He got back into his car, taking a moment to calm his nerves. As he drove off, the night seemed to close in around him, a reminder of the unseen and unknown that lurked just beyond the reach of his headlights. And so, the road remained, a silent witness to the lives that passed over it, the legacy of Mark Sullivan, a tale of torment and retribution, faded into legend, a cautionary story whispered among the townsfolk of Evershade. But the road, with its secrets and shadows, continued on, its dark tales forever woven into the fabric of the night. Thank you for joining me on this chilling journey. If your thirst for the unknown and the unexplained is still unquenched, I invite you to delve deeper into the abyss of terror. Just beyond the veil of reality, another story awaits to send shivers down your spine. Dare to join me in the next video, where the unknown becomes known and the unseen seen. Until then, keep the lights dim and your mind open. This is Professor Shadow, signing off.